And we're back on Consumer Choice Radio, coming to you on Sauga 960 AM in the Peel region and the Big Talker 106.7 in Wilmington, North Carolina. I have the pleasure of having another repeat guest on the show, the Member of Parliament for Beaches, East York, who quite handily won re-election again, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, first off, I did want to point out one thing from the campaign that I thought I at least appreciated, and that was, and you can step in and correct me if I frame this wrong, but I remember you posting something essentially saying Aaron O'Toole isn't that bad of a guy. We just have better policies. And I remember reading that and going, oh, we have an adult in the room on both sides, because I mean you have conservatives who are lighting their hair on fire over everything, and then on your team there were also folks who were kind of portraying O'Toole as like a Donald Trump light, and I just for a moment there it was like, oh, this is what politics could be, and so I just wanted to see if you could provide any color as to like what your perspective is, and maybe why that's not as common as it should be.
Yeah, it's not as common as it should be. And I think it partly comes down to, especially in a campaign, it's a team sport and you got to go out and win. And that means tearing the other team down in some ways. But it doesn't need to be like that. And I do think in our politics, when we take that approach, it's a short term gain for a long term loss of trust in the overall process. Because the fact of the matter is, I disagree with Aaron O'Toole on a number of policies, but I think we should find common agreement where we can, especially in a minority parliament. So here you have a leader who backed a huge expansion of the Canada Workers Benefit, which would help lift many people out of poverty. It's something I've called for in the past. It's something Charlie Angus from the NDP's called for in the past. Well, there's a space where we can work together on to lift people out of poverty in this country and to help build up basic income supports for working age Canadians, which is a huge missing middle when you think of our social safety net and social infrastructure. And so, I think we should find that kind of common ground where we can. Now, Aaron had a challenge because he ran as a true blue and he came back to really who he
Yep.
was in the course of the campaign. And that's a hard thing to trust and you don't know exactly
Hmm.
what you're getting. So, I made some pointed criticisms at the same time, but I do think he's night and day from where we saw Andrew Scheer lead the party. And I think he is trying to move the party back, and it's hard for them to do, but he's trying to move the party back to a more progressive conservatism.
Yeah, it almost reminded me as like the door opening to shifting to US politics for a second, where we would see at times folks like Justin Amash collaborate with AOC on
Right.
whatever it was they agreed upon. And I mean, for me, who's kind of like politically homeless, I thought that was quite refreshing. I'd certainly love to see more of that. Um, on some of the issues that you've really championed, and we've certainly given you credit for on this radio show, is harm reduction. And so the big question for you is what's next? What are some of the big items that you would love to see advanced over the course of this next minority government?
So at the tail end of the last minority government, the government introduced Bill C-22, which came in three parts, but it ended some mandatory minimum sentences, which there's no evidence to back those, and that's good. It restored conditional sentencing, that's good too. And the third element was actually a private member's bill that I drafted that then was incorporated as the third element of government legislation. And that was effectively, I knew the government wasn't going to decriminalize drugs and completely delete the possession offense. So I set out a number of health focused, evidence based principles. And basically, the goal was to fetter the discretion. So police and prosecutors, if that bill becomes law, which we've committed to reintroduce it within the first 100 days of this parliament, that it fetters the discretion of cops and of prosecutors so they can't move forward with a simple possession if it's not in accordance with these principles, it functionally never will be, right? So it de facto decriminalizes it. Will become virtually impossible to prosecute a simple possession charge, but it doesn't formally delete the offense. So it's not perfect. It's not exactly where I would have wanted to get in the end. And so I have turned my mind to, okay, where next? And one, we have to see that bill through. And there are a couple of amendments I think we can improve that legislation. And one of those amendments is I also want to see the federal government move much more quickly to work with municipalities and provinces where they want to decriminalize and move further on harm reduction and to save lives. And BC wants to do this. Vancouver already has a submission in to Health Canada. Montreal, Toronto, other municipalities are talking about this and putting some work in as well. And so I would love to see, again, to fetter the discretion of the health minister to say the minister shall grant exemptions from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act if the application is in accordance with these principles. And within a reasonable time period. Because what we've seen to date is there's a willingness, certainly from Minister Haidu. I know she's in a new portfolio now. And obviously the government sees this as a real live issue because now there's an associate minister dedicated to mental health and addictions. But the fact of the matter is, we have yet to fully embrace where the evidence is, where the public health experts are, where the police chiefs are, where people lived experience, people who've lost loved ones. We really do need to do more. And so I think if there's not political will to do it nationally right away, then at least get cities and provinces experimenting with it and show Canadians that the sky's not going to fall. You know, they said the sky was going to fall when we were legalizing cannabis. It didn't. If we decriminalize in Vancouver, if we decriminalize in BC, the sky's not going to fall. Canadians will learn that, and we can maybe do it nationally from there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point in terms of allowing smaller jurisdictions the option to kind of go that route. Um, Whenever I talk to people about the members of parliament who I think have great ideas here and there, I always bring your name up and I always talk about harm reduction. And a lot of people will say, well, I think that his comments fall on deaf ears. But in some sense, I almost feel like maybe some of your advocacy on this has shifted the Overton window in terms of what we can talk about. And I use Aaron O'Toole as an example because there were moments on the campaign where he was even acknowledging that arresting people was probably not the way to deal with substance abuse or illicit substances. And so do you feel like there's maybe a national tone that is shifting more in the direction that you and I would agree with?
I think unquestionably, yes. So it helps that you've got people living through a pandemic and they see politicians listen to public health experts, and public health expertise and advice has been prioritized. And guess what? They're not only calling for vaccinations, they're also calling for an end to the criminalization of drugs and to treat drug use as a health issue. So I think there's that element that is really impactful. Police chiefs being on board last July, they called for decriminalization. That helps. But it absolutely helps to have people in my position raising their voices and pushing. And I know this because the government was not going to introduce C-22 exactly as it was if I hadn't introduced the bill that I had a year earlier, right? And so I've seen the impact where in less than a year, the government actually picked up legislation that it will make a demonstrable difference. And then the question becomes, okay, how much further can we push? And the other part I will say is, you know, the government has taken steps not only on the criminalization side, but on the safe supply side. And so I think that's another area where when I think of how do we save lives, how do we pursue this conversation further? I think the Global Commission on Drug Policy has it right. The move ultimately has to be to strict regulation and a controlled and regulated supply, and decriminalization is but a step on that path to that controlled, regulated, and safe supply. And in some cases, very strictly regulated. Obviously, you know, penicillin is legal, but you can't get it except prescription from a doctor. And so there's this gradient of risk and availability and how we manage and control different substances for public health purposes. But, you know, getting to that place, I think we do have to lean into safe supply a lot more to save lives now, but also shift the conversation towards a regulatory one. And so in this parliament, credit to the government for getting there, I think sooner than later, but I think we still need sustained advocacy on that file as well to continue to move that window.
Yeah, it's a very good point in regards to how you keep moving this forward. And I always scratch my head because, I mean, for anyone who really talks about drug policy and how that intersects with the criminal justice system, a lot of the time Portugal is pointed to. And I've still yet to figure out why that hasn't really hooked the people who aren't on board, because it is very much a real case study in overall harm reduction and basically just treating it a different way. And in my eyes, it shows that the sky doesn't fall. It doesn't mean it's the Wild West and you have heroin sold at convenience stores. But it does take an approach that deals with it, in my opinion, in a much more adult manner. What is your take on whether or not Portugal has provided a good case study, or is my description of them being a good case study false?
No, it's a very good case study. and they were one of the first jurisdictions to pursue decriminalization in a serious way. And their model is a little bit more administrative in the sense that cops can still pick folks up, and they, instead of sending them to jail and the threat of incarceration, they might, just tell people to go on their way with a warning most often. But in some cases, they get sent to this dissuasion commission and tribunal, and thankfully that's a health focused tribunal. That's as it should be. But they do have more punitive administrative sanctions that they can levy. But look, the results speak for themselves. I think it was a 60% increase in people seeking treatment when they decriminalized. They saw overdose deaths go down. Drug use didn't go up in any demonstrable way. So overwhelmingly a success. Now, I would say we can get pretty close to that with C22, because what you're going to see in that legislation is police officers will be able to, yes, they technically can charge individuals. Prosecutors can technically still pursue a prosecution, but only consistent with these public health principles, which will really mean what we really see is cops give warnings to individuals to say, don't do this again, or they'll refer them to treatment on a voluntary basis, and continue to make sure that information is in their hand, or offer to drive them to that treatment center. And we'll see a lot more of that kind of community policing, I think, in an effective way. The real push, though, is going to require that the police chiefs who believe in this and have the resources to train their police officers, so it's on the ground, the boots on the ground are doing exactly what the police chiefs believe, because that disconnect still does happen, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There has to be some top-down leadership there from police chiefs who acknowledge what you're arguing, making sure that their officers are equipped with the know-how and the knowledge. I mean, I look at the debate about, I may be mispronouncing, but is it naloxone?
Right.
And whether or not law enforcement officers should have that on them to stop overdoses. And in my mind, it's like, well, yes, if those are the people who are getting called to respond to these things, then it should be a no-brainer. And then on the question of no-brainers, another one I wanted to pick your brain about is the excise tax on non-alcoholic beer, which I never knew existed until about this week. And I started doing some digging, and it's, I think, $2.82 a hectoliter. But for me, I could never find a really good justification for why it exists, because the use of sin taxes are obviously either to discourage use or to recover costs, like alcohol related costs for the healthcare system. But I don't think that would be appropriate for either if you look at non-alcoholic beer. And so I'm just curious as to what your take is on if it's appropriate to have an excise tax on non-alcoholic beer.
So I would say, obviously, we should not have an excise tax on non-alcoholic beer. I was unaware that we did, and I understand that we don't have an excise tax for non-alcoholic spirits and wine. So just as a matter of consistency, you'd think non-alcoholic beer would be part and parcel of that. I would also say we need to reform excise taxes a little more broadly than that too, because we also, I think, unfairly punish cannabis, those who
100%.
use cannabis.
Yep.
And we really have a novel, but unfortunately novel system when you compare jurisdictions across North America, where you have many jurisdictions that have sales taxes, jurisdictions that have excise taxes. Very few have both. And we not only have both, but we also don't have then a medicinal system that is providing the supply as needed. So we actually have excise taxes on medicinal cannabis, which is insane from the perspective of fairness and the perspective that you're talking about, which is we're not trying to dissuade medical cannabis, surely. So I think excise taxes need a much more serious look. Non-alcoholic beer, but I would also say a little bit broadly too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I recently had a piece in the Financial Post, and that was excise tax was one of the big ones. The $1 per gram, switching that to a floating percentage, getting rid of the excise tax on medical, which for most people, given that most people, if they are consumers of cannabis, are recreational consumers, so they have no idea that it exists for medical patients. And it's just a really insane disparity, in my view, because we don't do that for anything else. If a doctor prescribes you penicillin or any drug, you're not paying a sin tax on it. And so it just has always seemed quite strange to me that patients are getting soaked in the process. So that brings us to the end of this segment. We really appreciate you joining the show. Looking forward to seeing how you're going to carry the banner for harm reduction, but also the other things that you're passionate about in this next minority government.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.